At Thanksgiving dinner, my sister grabbed my phone, read one bank notification, and suddenly the room froze. $15 million. In less than 5 minutes, I went from the family disappointment to their golden goose. But here's the part they never saw coming. I'd already planned for this moment, and by the end of that dinner, I didn't just walk away with my fortune. I walked away free. Stick with me, because if you've ever been underestimated, this story is yours too. Clara Wells had grown accustomed to being the footnote in her own family's story. Not the headline, not the rising star, just the other one. She was the second daughter of Thomas and Eleanor Wells, a couple long embedded in the social fabric of Newton, Massachusetts, respectable, successful, and deeply invested in reputation. Thomas, a longtime executive at Bay Union Bank, was the type of man who introduced his job title before his first name. Eleanor, once a high school vice principal, was known for her polite smiles and sharply veiled judgments. And then there was Olivia, the older sister, the pride of the Wells legacy, the Ivy League law graduate turned Manhattan attorney with a brilliant husband, polished children, and Christmas cards that looked like magazine covers. Clara, on the other hand, ran an antique store in Boston's North End. They never outright said they were embarrassed of her, but it was there, nestled in the pauses after she spoke, the glances exchanged between her parents when she mentioned her shop, the way Olivia would smile a little too tightly when introducing her at family events. "Clara has this sweet little store," Olivia would say, her voice dipped in condescension like Clara was still 5 years old, playing with wooden blocks. But it hadn't always stung. Not at first. Clara had known even as a child that she moved to a rhythm her family couldn't hear. While Olivia polished her debate trophies and scheduled mock trials for fun, Clara spent hours in the attic brushing dust off her grandfather's compass or flipping through brittle pages of old diaries. She loved the silence of forgotten things, the way an object held memory long after the people were gone. In high school, while Olivia gave speeches at Model UN, Clara restored a broken mantel clock she found at a yard sale. When she chose to major in art history, the room had fallen quiet, not disappointed, just dismissive. "You're so creative," her mother had said with a thin smile. "Just make sure you can support yourself, sweetheart." The memory that haunted Clara most came from the summer Olivia graduated from Columbia Law. The house was packed with aunts, uncles, third cousins, everyone dressed in pastel, sipping wine, celebrating the prodigy. Olivia arrived late fashionably, so her boyfriend turned fiancé in tow. She made an entrance like someone who knew they belonged at the center of the room. Clara had stood by the sideboard, arranging a tray of lemon bars. No one noticed. Later that night, as guests filtered out and congratulations floated through the house, Clara overheard her Aunt Valerie whisper to her mother, "And what about Clara? What's her plan these days?" Her mother's voice had been calm. "She's following her interests. She has a good heart. Not bright, not ambitious, not exceptional, just good-hearted." That was the day Clara stopped trying to explain herself. Years passed. She earned her master's degree, quietly working evenings and weekends to pay for it. While Olivia made partner at her firm, Clara rented a narrow storefront in Boston and named it Echo in Time. She didn't take out loans. She didn't ask her parents for a cent. The shop became her sanctuary, cluttered with the quiet dignity of other people's pasts. She specialized in restoration, historical valuation, and sourcing obscure collectibles. She built a network. She learned the language of provenance and estate liquidation. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. Still, to her family, it remained that little store. A hobby, a phase, a polite inconvenience. You know, her mother would murmur at dinners, you could always go back to school. Maybe teaching? Sometimes Olivia would joke. At least when the apocalypse comes, Clara can barter with buttons and teapots. Everyone would laugh. Clara would smile. That night, as snow began falling across Boston, Clara stood at the window of her apartment, a modest one-bedroom directly above the shop. The light from the street lamps cast soft halos on the sidewalk, blurring footprints into melting shadows. Her cat Juniper stretched on the windowsill, purring against the glass. Clara sipped her tea and let the warmth spread through her hands. Below her, the store was quiet. Upstairs, the world had paused. This was her piece. It wasn't the kind of success her family admired. There were no newspaper profiles, no corner offices, no committee chairs or board meetings. But Clara owned her shop outright. She owned the building. She had no debt. And inside her modest lifestyle was a fortune carefully privately amassed. But they didn't know that, and perhaps she thought that was the point. She looked out over the snowy street and whispered to no one in particular, "They never saw me. Not really, but I've always seen myself." And in that small, unspoken truth, Clara felt more powerful than she ever had. It had started with a letter. Not a business plan, not a 5-year forecast, just a single yellowed envelope buried in a box of costume jewelry at a church basement sale. Clara remembered the moment with crystalline clarity. She had been 24 only a few months into opening Echo in Time. The store was still half empty, her savings dangerously low. She'd walked into the yard sale looking for a display tray and left with a piece of American history. The letter had been sealed in a faded oilskin pouch, addressed in delicate calligraphy to Miss Eleanor Brooks, inside 4 pages of a Union soldier's final letter before Gettysburg. The ink was steady, but aching a man in love, writing as if he wouldn't return. And he hadn't. Clara paid $20 for the box. She knew what she held before she'd even finished reading. The signature matched a documented casualty. The regiment details checked out. After months of authentication, she sold the letter for $100,000 to a private Civil War archive in Connecticut. She never told her family. They wouldn't have understood. Not just the money, the why. It wasn't luck. It was instinct training obsession. It was time spent learning how to hear what others couldn't, the echoes hidden in things long abandoned. Over the years, there were other finds. A hand-carved shaker box mislabeled at a flea market in Vermont, flipped for $12,000. A Navajo textile fragment, verified through dye analysis, sold at auction for nearly $80,000. Once a dealer nearly threw away a 19th-century mourning brooch that concealed a lock of hair gold-mounted. Clara recognized its period provenance and placement within an emerging niche collection. She didn't spend the profits. Not really. Instead, she saved with a kind of sacred discipline. She lived simply. She reinvested wisely. When Boston's real estate softened after a development bubble burst, Clara bought her storefront's building outright, then a duplex in Cambridge, then another brownstone near the harbor, all under a quiet LLC, obscured through layers of careful documentation. She drove a 12-year-old Volvo. Her wardrobe was mostly neutral knits and wool skirts. Her phone case was peeling at the corners. People assumed she was modest because she had little. She let them assume. There was a certain freedom in invisibility. Clara kept her circle small, a few friends, a rotating staff of part-time students and preservation interns. And one man she trusted with her full financial truth, John Densmore, a quiet retired CPA and an old friend of her father. John had known the Wells family since Clara was a child. He'd seen her coloring antique furniture catalogs at age 7. He'd also seen how her family dismissed that curiosity as cute, not capable. When she first approached him about setting up her financial structures, he didn't ask why. He just nodded, then spent 3 months building her protection like a fortress. Now they met once every quarter in his converted attic office above a watch repair shop. No assistants. No digital trails. "I filed the Delaware entity paperwork this morning," he said, sliding a folder across the desk. "The final trust instrument's in here. You're now the manager of all 3 properties and the commercial building without appearing as owner on any of them." Clara exhaled. "Thank you." John gave a slow smile. "Anyone else in the family aware?" She shook her head. "Not a word." He leaned back in his creaking leather chair. "Can I ask why you keep it this way?" Clara hesitated. The words came slowly, shaped by years of silence. "They think I'm quiet because I've failed," she said. "But I stay quiet because if they ever saw what I've built, they'd try to claim pieces of it, like they're entitled to it, like I owe them something for becoming more than they expected." She paused. They didn't want me when I was broke, they just tolerated me. John's gaze softened. And now I know who they are, she said. The silence. It wasn't weakness. It was the only boundary they couldn't cross. Back at her store later that evening, Clara watched the sun melt into the edge of the skyline beyond the Charles River. Her shop was closed for the day, but the air still held the scent of old paper and waxed wood. She passed her fingers over a restored clock's casing, polished to a low amber gleam. The world outside bustled, MBTA trains rattling, people laughing across cobblestones. But within echo and time, the stillness was sacred. To most, it was just a vintage shop. But Clara knew what it truly was: a testament. A reclamation. A house of stories where forgotten things could matter again. And in some way, it mirrored her life. People had overlooked her for so long, mistaking her gentleness for irrelevance. But now she moved through the world like a cipher, unreadable, unbothered, and quietly powerful. They thought she was silent because she had nothing. But the truth: she had stayed silent so they would never try to take what she had finally built for herself. The Wells home looked exactly as Clara remembered: impeccably decorated, gleaming with curated warmth, and just a little too perfect. The scent of roasted turkey sage and her mother's cranberry compote lingered in the air, like a well-rehearsed memory. The dining room table was already set when Clara arrived, candles flickering in tall brass holders, napkins folded into swans. She had driven in from Boston that morning, her Volvo parked modestly beside Olivia's luxury SUV in the driveway. No one greeted her at the door. They never did, but she was used to that. "Clara," her mother called from the kitchen, voice bright and brittle. "So good of you to make it. I wasn't sure you'd be able to get away from the shop." Clara offered a quiet smile. "I closed early." As she hung her coat, Olivia swept in with her usual perfume and perfectly pressed blazer. "Still playing antiques, sis," she said with a smirk, hugging her stiffly. "I read somewhere that eBay's taking over everything. Must be hard keeping up." Clara didn't rise to it. She never did. "Business is steady," she replied. "Thanks for asking." The house buzzed with low conversation and silverware clinking against china. Olivia's 2 kids played in the den. Derek, her husband, was on a call in the study, and their father stood by the bar cart swirling his usual scotch, offering half smiles and hollow comments to whoever wandered near. It was Thanksgiving, but it felt more like a board meeting. Dinner began the way it always did, with Olivia leading the conversation. She spoke of mergers, of case wins, of some exclusive client dinner in Tribeca. Their parents nodded, delighted, proud. Clara sat between her mother and the window, her plate half full, her voice unused. "So, Clara," their father said after the first glass of wine had softened the edge of the silence. "Still running that little storefront downtown?" Clara cut into her turkey. "Yes, still running. I imagine walk-ins are tough these days," her mother added. "You've always been resourceful, though. I'm sure you're scraping by." Olivia chuckled lightly. "Well, not everyone needs a 6-figure income to be happy, right? Clara's more minimalist." Clara looked out the window. Snow had started to fall, not heavily, but enough to gather in soft corners along the edge of the porch. She wanted to respond, but she didn't. Some part of her had always known they would never see her clearly, but knowing it didn't stop the sting. Dessert arrived: pecan pie, Olivia's favorite, and Clara stepped into the kitchen to grab a few napkins. Her phone buzzed on the counter, face up. Notification. First Horizon. "Private congratulations, your total assets have now exceeded $15,000. The number glowed on the screen like an exposed nerve. Olivia walked in holding 2 espresso cups. She glanced at the phone, then froze. "What is this?" Clara turned too late. Olivia was already holding the phone, eyes scanning the message. Her brow furrowed, then lifted. She looked at her sister like she had just unmasked a stranger. "Clara, is this real?" Clara didn't answer. A second passed, then another. Olivia stepped back into the dining room, phone still in hand. "Everyone," she said, her voice slicing through the chatter. "Clara has a trust account with over $15 million. The room fell into silence. Forks halted midair. Derek looked up. Their mother blinked, visibly confused. Their father straightened his tie. "What?" their mother asked slowly. "That can't be right." Clara stood in the doorway, silent. Olivia turned to her, voice sharpened by disbelief. "Is this some kind of mistake? Or have you just been hiding this?" "I haven't been hiding," Clara said, voice calm. "I've just never been asked." Their father cleared his throat. "Where would you get that kind of money? You're not running a hedge fund." "I built it," Clara said. "Over time, through the store, investments. I worked, I saved." "You mean all this time," Derek interjected, "while we've been trying to save for the twins' college, while we cut vacations? You've just been sitting on millions." "They're your children, Derek." Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Their mother stood up now. "But why wouldn't you say anything?" "We thought you were struggling." "We offered help. You offered pity," Clara said. "Not help." The air had shifted. It wasn't just awkward anymore. It was accusatory. Unspoken judgments ricocheted around the table like stray bullets. Olivia still held the phone like it might explode. "So what, you just sit on all this money while the rest of us think you're barely scraping by?" "That's manipulative." Clara's expression didn't change. "You always talked about family," Olivia continued. "How it's about support. What happened to that, huh?" Clara looked at her sister, perfectly composed, legally righteous, suddenly very interested in redistribution. "What happened," Clara said softly, "is that I learned the only time you all cared to know anything about me was when there was something to take." She walked to the table, picked up her coat, her scarf. No one stopped her. She opened the front door, letting the cold night air flood into the house. Behind her, a room full of people who had never asked who she was, only now realizing she wasn't who they thought. And Clara finally no longer cared. For a moment, after the truth shattered the illusion, the Wells dining room was suspended in a silence so thick it swallowed even the clink of silverware. Clara stood near the entryway, coat draped over one arm, the scent of roasted pecans and turkey gravy clinging to a moment that no longer felt like a holiday. No one spoke. Not immediately. Then Olivia exhaled a sharp, deliberate breath that cracked the room open again. "Okay," she said, setting Clara's phone down like it burned. "Let's all take a breath. No one's accusing anyone of anything. Yet." Her voice was a mixture of disbelief and calculation, the lawyer in her already parsing the implications. "Thomas Wells." Their father leaned back in his chair. His fingers were steepled, eyes narrowed. 15 million, he murmured almost to himself. "That's not normal. For antiques." Their mother was still blinking her wineglass, held mid-air like she'd forgotten what to do with it. "Why would you keep something like this from us?" Clara looked down at the table, then back up. "Because you never asked." "Not really. Not with curiosity. Just condescension." Derek, Olivia's husband, cleared his throat. "I mean, look." He began with the faux casual tone of someone entering delicate territory. "I think we're all just surprised, but maybe this is a good thing. Maybe this is the opportunity the family's been waiting for." Clara tilted her head. "Opportunity? Well?" Derek continued, adjusting his Rolex. "There are things we've been discussing for a while. Olivia and I were just saying last week, if we could pool together some capital, maybe buy a second home. Something for everyone to use. You know, a family retreat? Vermont, maybe. Or Martha's Vineyard." Olivia picked up the thread without missing a beat. "And the twins' college fund has been a concern. We've been doing what we can, obviously, but with inflation. And your father's been talking about retiring sooner," their mother added. "Your store must be generating more than enough now, Clara. Maybe this is your chance to give back." "Give back?" Clara stared at them, not angry, not even surprised. Just profoundly tired. Olivia leaned forward. "We could set up a family trust, something sustainable. You wouldn't even have to manage it yourself. I could help with legal structuring. I have contacts." "You mean," Clara said slowly, You'd control it? That's not fair, Olivia snapped. We're talking about shared resources, for the family. Thomas nodded, fingers tapping the table. It's only right. We've supported you. You lived under this roof when you started that shop. Clara's eyebrows lifted. I paid rent. Their mother waved her hand as if brushing away the memory. Nominal. And we helped you with college. Loans, paperwork. I paid that all back. With interest, Clara said. Another silence stretched between them. Then Olivia spoke, sharp and sudden. Clara, are you laundering money? The question hit the table, like a gavel. What Clara blinked. No one makes $15 million in antiques unless they're flipping stolen art or doing under-the-table deals, Olivia said. Are you even reporting it? Do you understand the legal exposure you've created for yourself? For us? You think I'm a criminal, Clara said, voice steady. I think you've been hiding. And when people hide money, there's usually a reason, Derek chimed in again. Look, it's not about judging you. But if this ever got out, it could affect our reputations, the press, my practice. Olivia's firm. The optics would be… Clara interrupted him, her voice quiet, razor sharp. You're worried this will make you look bad? No, Olivia snapped. We're worried about what this means. It looks like you've been lying. To whom? Clara asked. To us, her mother whispered. Clara stared at her family, the people who once called her career a hobby, her passion a phase. The people who now faced with a number had flipped the board and redrawn all the rules. I see, Clara said. She reached for her coat again. Clara, Olivia said quickly, don't be dramatic. We're trying to find a way forward. Clara paused. Am I valuable to you now? No one answered. Because last Thanksgiving, you said I should consider teaching preschool if the antique thing didn't pan out. The year before, Dad asked me if I wanted to marry rich. And you all thought I didn't notice. Her voice didn't waver. But something in it broke, not from pain, but from finality. You didn't want to know me, you wanted to measure me, and now that I pass your metrics, I'm suddenly family again. It's not like that, her mother said. You're twisting. No, Clara said, sliding her arms into her coat. You just don't like the mirror. She stepped toward the door. You've misunderstood us, Thomas said. No, Clara replied without looking back. You misunderstood me. That's the only reason you're shocked. Outside, the wind carried snow across the porch in slow, slanting waves. She descended the steps, boots crunching over frozen leaves. The cold hit her face sharp and clean. She walked to her car without glancing back. And in the hush of that winter night, beneath the glittering dark sky, and the glow of a house full of strangers who once called themselves family, Clara felt not angry, not vindicated, but free. The drive home was quiet, not peaceful, not chaotic, just quiet, the kind of stillness that lives between shock and clarity. Clara didn't play music. She didn't cry. Her hands gripped the steering wheel not out of fear, but to hold herself together. By the time she reached her apartment above the shop, the snow had thickened into a soft, steady hush. The windows were frosted at the corners. Juniper, her cat, blinked up at her from the sofa, unaware of the tectonic shift that had occurred hours earlier over a table lined with cranberry sauce and concealed disappointment. Clara dropped her coat on the rack and sat at her kitchen counter. The silence wrapped around her like a blanket, not comforting, not suffocating. Just honest. Then she reached for her phone. Contact Dr. Elise Monroe, message sent. Can you see me tomorrow? I need to talk. A reply came within minutes. Yes, 10 a.m. Video or in person, video's fine. Thank you. At 10:01 the next morning, Clara sat on her living room couch, wrapped in a sweater and holding a mug of untouched tea. Her therapist's face filled the laptop screen, calm, steady, with that particular warmth only earned through years of sitting with broken stories. Hi, Clara, Dr. Monroe said gently. What happened? And just like that, it spilled. Not as anger, not even as pain, but as exhaustion. They saw the money, Clara said, voice hoarse, and suddenly I mattered. Suddenly they were making plans. Like my entire identity had changed, like it now had utility. Dr. Monroe nodded. And how did that feel? Like everything I feared was true, that they never really respected me, just tolerated me until I became valuable. And what did you do? I left. Her voice broke on the word, but not from regret. From release. Dr. Monroe's eyes softened. What are you feeling now? Clara paused, staring past the camera. Relief, she admitted, and guilt. But mostly, I'm tired of proving myself to people who don't want to understand me. You're not alone in that feeling, Dr. Monroe said. But I want you to ask yourself something. Have you ever set a boundary with them before this moment? Clara blinked. No, not really. Then this wasn't just a financial betrayal. It was the first time you told the truth about what you needed. Later that afternoon, after Juniper curled up in her lap and the world turned quiet again, Clara sat down at her desk. She pulled out a thick sheet of stationery, uncapped her fountain pen, and wrote a letter, not to anyone else, to herself. Dear Clara, you were not wrong for keeping your distance. You were not cruel for staying silent. You were protecting yourself from the kind of harm that doesn't leave bruises, only questions. Why am I never enough? You thought if you worked harder, loved better, bent further, they would see you. But now you know love isn't something earned through erasure. You didn't build walls. You built a home where your spirit could rest. They just never knocked. The silence wasn't cowardice. It was survival. And now it's strength. Let this be the last time you mistake proximity for love. Let this be the first time you choose yourself fully, quietly, and without explanation. Love me. That evening, a message arrived. Olivia, I've been thinking. Maybe we all overreacted. Can we talk if you're ready to be honest? Clara stared at the screen. There it was. The olive branch dipped in control. The apology wrapped in terms. The conditional connection. She didn't reply. She wouldn't reply. For the first time, Clara felt what it meant to truly belong to herself. And it was enough. That night, she opened her journal and wrote something new. Not a quote, not a memory. A vow. From now on, I will not explain myself to people who only show up when there's something to gain. My peace isn't negotiable. My value isn't conditional. Outside, the snow kept falling, but inside something had thawed. The magazine arrived in a plain manila envelope, no note, no fanfare. Just an embossed cover with a copper-gilt header, New England Historical Quarterly. Clara only realized the issue had been published when she saw her store Echo in Time on page 27, centered between columns of serif type and archival photographs. The article titled Preservation in Practice, the Quiet Revival of Heritage Spaces, detailed how a modest shop in Boston had become a cornerstone for historical storytelling in the region. She skimmed the first few lines, blinking once. Owned and operated by Clara Wells Echo in Time, specializes not only in antiques, but in reanimating the forgotten narratives behind each item. Rather than treating history as static, Wells curates the past as a living dialogue where stories are not just told, but continued. She didn't smile. Not exactly. But a warmth lit quietly inside her. Not because of the praise, but because someone had finally seen her work for what it truly was. By midweek, the article made the rounds online and foot traffic at the shop doubled. Not crowds, she didn't deal in viral fads, but the kind of visitors who lingered, who asked questions, who came not just to buy, but to remember. One cold Thursday morning, as Clara was adjusting a shelf of pressed flower lockets, the door opened with a soft chime. A woman entered, brushing snow from her coat, followed by a girl who looked no older than 9. "Are you Clara?" the woman asked. "I am Clara," replied, stepping forward. "My daughter June read about your shop in a magazine her teacher gave her. She's obsessed with old clocks." Clara glanced down. June was clutching a small sketchbook, the edges curled from use. Her cheeks were red from the cold, but her eyes sparkled with a kind of focus Clara recognized immediately. "Well then," Clara said, crouching a little to meet the girl's eye, "you've come to the right place." She led them to the back wall, where the oldest pieces lived: a late 1800s Seth Thomas regulator, a French carriage clock from 1847, and a collection of pocket watches, each restored, labeled, and ticking with soft reverence. June stood in front of the display, silent at first. Then she asked, "How do you know how to fix them?" Clara smiled. "Because I listened to them first. History talks if you let it." June's mother laughed softly, but the girl was serious. "Can I ever learn that?" "You already are," Clara said. She walked to the case, opened it gently, and pulled out a small brass-cased pocket watch. Its face was worn, but the second hand moved with quiet resolve. "This belonged to a train conductor who worked overnight routes during the war," Clara said, placing it in June's hands. "It was a gift from his wife. She had it engraved. 'Every second brings you home.'" June traced the etched words with her thumb. Clara knelt beside her. "History isn't just something we study. It's something we continue. It's a kind of storytelling. And you, June, you can tell big stories, too." The girl looked up at her mother, then back at Clara. "Really? Really?" Clara pressed the watch into her small palms. "This one's for you." June gasped. "You're giving it to me." Clara nodded. "It's time someone young held on to something old." The mother's eyes welled, her voice tight. "Are you sure?" Clara nodded again. "He would have liked that." Later that evening after closing, Clara found a letter tucked in the mail slot. Not a bill, not a business inquiry, just a handwritten note. "Dear Ms. Wells, I don't think you remember me, but last spring I brought in a music box that had belonged to my grandmother. You spent weeks restoring it. No charge, even though I insisted. Last night we played the box for the first time in decades. My father, who hadn't spoken about his mother since she died, sat down beside it and cried. Then he told us stories we'd never heard about how she sang the same song every Sunday, how she danced in the kitchen when no one was looking. That box didn't just play music, it brought her back to us. Thank you. Warmly, Eleanor Jameson." Clara read the note twice. Then she placed it in a drawer where she kept other quiet thank yous, faded postcards, pressed flowers, fragments of gratitude folded gently like origami. She wasn't the kind of woman who made noise, but in the silence her work had left marks, like fingerprints on glass, invisible until the light shifted just right. At closing time that Friday, Clara stood behind the register watching the last rays of winter sun drift across the showroom. Every object had its place, every story its silence. People often asked what her store sold, but Clara had long stopped thinking in terms of inventory. Echo in Time didn't sell antiques, it returned memories. It honored what was almost forgotten. It handed stories from one hand to another like passing a flame, and that Clara knew now was an empire of its own. It was a Sunday afternoon in early March, the kind of day where winter hadn't quite let go, but spring was already whispering from the edges. A soft drizzle tapped against the windows of Clara's apartment above the shop. The city below was quieter than usual, as if it too had paused to listen. Clara sat at her writing desk, the same one she'd used as a teenager to sketch floor plans of imaginary museums and write poems she never read aloud. Now it held her tea, her favorite pen, and a blank sheet of thick ivory paper. For weeks she had tried to move on without turning back. But a heaviness still lingered, not pain, not longing, but something harder to name. A weight lodged not in her body, but in the parts of her that still flinched at old echoes. So she picked up the pen, not to reconnect, not to reopen wounds, but to close them. At the top of the page, she wrote, "Olivia," and then she began. "You called my passion a phase, a hobby, a little game with old things. You laughed when I talked about preservation, called my first shop a thrift store knockoff. But from those things, the junk you mocked, I built a life. I built a purpose. I learned how to listen to silence and translate it into memory. I gave forgotten objects back their voice. You called my silence weakness. But it wasn't. It was survival. It was the quiet place where I kept the parts of me that didn't need your approval to stay alive. You said I was secretive. that I should have told you what I was building. But when I tried to share anything before a client's story, a restoration, I was proud of your eyes glazed. You said things like, "That's cute," or "Must be nice to have time for hobbies." So I stopped telling you. Not because I was ashamed, but because I finally understood that not everyone is meant to understand. And not everyone deserves to. You demanded an explanation when you saw my bank account. You questioned my ethics, my honesty. You made plans with money you didn't earn, told yourself it was for the good of the family. But the truth is, you were never angry that I had something. You were angry that I kept it from you because you believed you were entitled to it. That's not love. That's ownership. And I'm not yours to own. I used to believe if I could just prove myself, you'd respect me. If I dressed a little more like you, spoke a little more like you, took your advice more seriously. I kept thinking the next degree of success would buy me a seat at your table, one where I wasn't the butt of the joke or the footnote in your stories. But it turns out the only thing that changed when I became successful was the volume of your interest. And that's when I knew I don't want a seat at that table, not anymore. I don't hate you, Olivia. That would take more energy than I'm willing to give. But I am done waiting for you to see me. I see myself now, and that's enough. I'm not writing this to reconcile. I'm writing it to release. Goodbye, Clara. She set the pen down, exhaled. The letter sat there soft-edged and fierce in its honesty. Not cruel, just true. She read it once, then again, and then with slow, deliberate hands she folded it in half, then in quarters, and finally she tore it cleanly, purposefully into quiet strips. She didn't cry, she didn't shake. She smiled faintly, but fully. Because she didn't need Olivia to read those words. She didn't need validation or confrontation. She just needed to know she had said them, even if only to herself. The pieces went into the fireplace, one by one. No ceremony, no rage, just release. The flame caught quickly, curling the paper into ash. Outside, the rain had stopped. The sky was still gray, but it no longer pressed down on her. It simply was like so many things Clara no longer needed to carry. She made another cup of tea. Juniper jumped onto the armchair, curling into a soft, contented shape. And Clara, woman of silence, survivor of dismissal, builder of invisible empires, sat by the window with her tea in hand and her soul just a little lighter. She didn't look back. Not because the past didn't matter, but because she finally knew it no longer owned her. It was a Saturday evening in late spring, the kind where Boston air felt soft with renewal, and the sun lingered just long enough to cast amber streaks through the tall glass windows of echo and time. Clara moved with quiet grace between the display tables, now cleared of most antique wares. A linen runner stretched across the mahogany counter. Soft music played from the vintage radio, a slow jazz number that curled around the room like candlelight. She wasn't preparing for a crowd, just a gathering. 6 chairs, a handful of names, and not a single person who had ever asked her to shrink. There was Nora, her assistant from the museum archives, bright-eyed, fiercely loyal with hands always stained by ink or dust. There was Mr. James from the Preservation Council, who once helped Clara secure a rare catalog from 1893. And Eleanor, the woman who'd written about the music box, arrived, carrying a tray of scones, still warm from her oven. At 6:03, the bell above the shop door chimed again. It was June now, with a new pair of glasses and her hair tied back in a ribbon. Her mother followed behind, holding a wrapped bundle Clara suspected was handmade bread. "Wow," June whispered, staring at the flickering candles and the crystal glasses Clara had taken out just this once. "Welcome," Clara smiled, kneeling slightly. "There's someone I want you to meet." She led June to an older man in a worn wool blazer, Robert, a retired horologist who'd spent 4 decades restoring cathedral clocks in upstate Vermont. He and June were soon deep in a conversation about escapements and balance springs. Clara stepped back and watched, heart swelling. No one at the table had come for prestige. No one had come because they wanted something from her. They came because they saw her. And she had chosen them too. Dinner was simple. A roasted vegetable tart Clara made from her mother's old recipe, with a few changes, of course. a salad with pears and shaved fennel, bread from June's mother, who confessed she'd studied Clara's handwriting from the note on the antique clock and copied it onto a card that read, "Your stories helped me remember mine." Wine was poured, laughter scattered between courses like rose petals. No formal toasts, no agenda. Just stories, shared freely without currency. At one point, Eleanor leaned over and said, "You know, there's something sacred about this place. It's like memory lives in the walls." Clara smiled. "I think memory just likes good company." There was no mention of Olivia. No maybe she'll call. No empty seat held in hope. No ache in her absence. The wound had closed, not with bitterness, but with clarity. Some people are meant to be chapters, not lifelines. After dessert, a blackberry cobbler with brown sugar crust, the guests trickled out slowly, offering long hugs, handwritten notes, promises to return. June lingered by the clock display until her mother gently nudged her coat over her shoulders. "Thanks for making her feel seen," the mother whispered at the door. "It's rare. She made herself seen," Clara said. "I just handed her the right lens." By 9:30, the shop was quiet again. Still glowing, Clara blew out the candles one by one, washed the glasses, folded the linen runner. Then she lit the fireplace, a small one she'd installed in the corner for winter nights and rare moments like this. The soft crackle of flame met the rhythmic ticking of the clocks, each marking its own time, each echoing something both old and ongoing. She pulled a chair beside the fire, poured herself one last glass of wine. Outside, the street lamps flickered against the windows. Inside, the light danced across her face, not harsh, not extravagant. Just enough. She took a long breath and for the first time in years felt her body fully exhale. She didn't need a grand gesture to mark this moment. She had chosen herself. She had let go of love that had strings, of family ties that only nodded, of seats at tables where silence was mistaken for irrelevance. She had set her own. And this little table in the shop she built with quiet hands and sleepless nights, this was a feast in its own right. As the hour struck 10, the clocks chimed in gentle chorus. Not loud, not commanding, but clear. Clara looked around at the room she had filled with voices from the past and realized she had finally given herself one. "They didn't celebrate me," she whispered aloud, raising her glass slightly toward the fire. "But I've learned how to celebrate myself." And with that, she leaned back in her chair, the warmth of the flames flickering across glass, brass, and old wood. Outside, the world moved on. But inside, echo in time, Clara Wells, once dismissed, once invisible, sat in the light of her own making. Unapologetic, unafraid, unshakably home.